My mother tried to pay my fiancé to leave me. Then she showed up at my wedding wearing a bridal dress. Growing up, I always knew my mother, Teresa, loved me more than anything in the world. It was an undeniable, overwhelming kind of love, the kind that, as a child, I thought was normal. After all, isn't a mother supposed to love her child unconditionally? But as I got older, I began to understand that love, when unchecked, can start to feel suffocating. I was born and raised in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. My father was never in the picture. He left when I was too young to remember him. It was always just me and my mother until she remarried when I was 10. By then, her identity had become completely wrapped around being my mother. I was her everything, her whole world, her reason for living. She told me these things daily, as if reminding me that my existence gave her purpose. At first, I saw it as sweet, but over time, it became a weight on my shoulders. Because I was an only child, I was the sole focus of her attention. She didn't have other children to divide her love between, and she didn't have many friends. She had acquaintances, moms from school functions, neighbors she occasionally chatted with, but I was her primary emotional outlet. From as early as I can remember, she talked to me about everything, her problems at work, her frustrations with family, her worries about money, and later, her issues with my stepfather, Mark. She never treated me like a child. I was more of a confidant. When I was in middle school, she would come home from work, pour a glass of wine, and vent to me about her day like we were two adults unwinding after a long day. I knew about her coworkers' betrayals, my uncle's financial struggles, and even things about my stepfather that no child should know about their parents' marriage. At the time, I didn't realize how inappropriate it was. I liked feeling needed. I liked being important to her. But as I grew older, I started to recognize the imbalance. It wasn't just that she was confiding in me, it was that she relied on me emotionally in a way that wasn't fair for a child. There were nights when she would cry, and I would sit on the couch next to her, holding her hand, telling her everything would be okay, just like a spouse or a best friend would. But I wasn't her spouse, and I wasn't her best friend. I was her daughter. Despite the emotional burden, I still loved her. She was my mother, and she had always been there for me. I never went without food, without clothes, without shelter. She worked long hours as a nurse, sometimes double shifts, to make sure I had a good life. And when she met Mark, I thought maybe things would change, that maybe she would shift some of her attention to him and let me just be a kid. But if anything, her attachment to me only grew stronger. Mark wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't particularly warm either. He tolerated my mother's attachment to me, but I think he found it strange. I never felt like he wanted me around, but I also never felt like he hated me. He was simply indifferent. My mother, on the other hand, acted as though I was the love of her life. Even after marrying Mark, she would say things like, "You're my first love," or, "No one will ever love me the way you do." It was bizarre, but I had grown so accustomed to it that I didn't question it. By the time I was a teenager, the dynamic became more suffocating. My mother wanted to be involved in every aspect of my life. She didn't just ask about my friends, she wanted to be part of my friend group. She would offer to drive us places and then stay, as if she was one of us. She would read my texts over my shoulder, not in a disciplinary way, but as if she was genuinely interested in the gossip of my teenage world. When I started dating, it became even worse. She would make comments about how I didn't need a boyfriend, how no one would ever love me as much as she did, how she didn't want to lose me to some teenage boy. She would cry when I spent too much time away from home. The final straw came when I was 17. I had my first serious boyfriend, and after nearly a year of dating, I told my mother that I was thinking about going to the same college as him, across the country, in New York. She lost it. She sobbed, begged, and accused me of abandoning her. She even got Mark involved, trying to convince me that I was making a mistake. When guilt-tripping didn't work, she switched tactics. She told me that if I left, she wouldn't know what to do with herself. That she had no purpose without me. That she might not make it if I went so far away. I still left. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but I knew I had to do it. I needed space, independence, a life that was mine and not just an extension of hers. I moved to New York for college and barely spoke to her for the first year. She called and texted constantly, but I kept my responses brief. Over time, we reestablished some form of contact, but it was never the same. The distance allowed me to see how unhealthy our relationship had been. Years passed, and I built my own life. I got married without telling her until after the fact, partly because I didn't want the drama and partly because I knew how she and Mark felt about my ex-husband. They had even offered him money to leave me, which still enraged me when I thought about it. Even after I got divorced, I kept my distance. But no matter how much space I put between us, my mother never stopped trying to pull me back in. Her love wasn't just motherly, it was possessive. And no matter how much I tried to escape it, she always found ways to remind me that, in her eyes, I belonged to her. By the time I turned 28, I had built a life that was truly my own. I had a job I loved, friends who felt like family, and most importantly, a relationship that felt healthy and secure. My fiancé, Daniel, was everything my ex-husband wasn't: kind, stable, and completely unbothered by the chaos of my family. He knew about my complicated relationship with my mother, though he had only seen glimpses of it firsthand. Still, he supported my decision to keep a polite but cautious distance. When he proposed, it was everything I had ever wanted: simple, intimate, and free from the overwhelming drama that had plagued my past relationships. We were on a weekend trip to a cabin in Vermont, surrounded by snow-covered trees, when he pulled out the ring. A ruby and lab-grown diamond set in yellow gold, stunning, unique, and completely me. I was overjoyed, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this new chapter in my life would be uncomplicated. Of course, I should have known better. That evening, I sent a picture of my ring to my mother. I knew she would want to know, and despite everything, part of me still craved some level of maternal approval. A simple, "That's beautiful," or "I'm so happy for you," would have been enough. Instead, her response was odd. "That's pretty," she said. And then she changed the subject. At first, I thought she simply didn't realize it was an engagement ring, so I clarified. "Daniel proposed. We're engaged." I expected excitement, or at the very least, acknowledgement. But what I got in return made my stomach twist. She told me she had been planning to buy me a similar ring, a ruby ring in white gold, significantly more expensive than mine, and even sent me a link to it, along with screenshots of conversations she had with a friend about wanting to get it for me. The link explicitly labeled it as an engagement ring. I stared at my phone, trying to process what I was looking at. The fact that she had been planning to buy me a ring so similar to the one Daniel had just proposed with was strange enough. But the fact that it was marketed as an engagement ring, that was something else entirely. She didn't even say congratulations until hours later. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe she had meant it as a sentimental gift, not realizing how it would come across. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. This wasn't the first time she had done something like this. When I was younger, she would make comments about how she and I didn't need anyone else, how we were a team, how no one could love me the way she did. At the time, I thought she was just being a protective mother, but now, as an adult, I saw it differently. There was an intensity to her love that didn't feel quite right. Even after I moved across the country, even after I built my own life, even after I tried to set boundaries, she still found ways to insert herself. It was as if, in her mind, I would always belong to her. A month later, Daniel and I flew to Portland for Christmas. I was nervous but hopeful maybe, now that she had some time to process the engagement, she would be happy for me. Maybe things would be normal. They weren't. The entire visit, she never once brought up the engagement. "No, I'm so happy for you." "No, tell me about the wedding plans." No excitement, no warmth, just silence. Even though she adored Daniel and had always been kind to him, she still acted as if this massive life event simply wasn't happening. By the end of the trip, I was exhausted. I had spent days waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, some moment where she would finally act like a normal mother. But it never came. Then, on the way to the airport, something in me snapped. I told her how hurt I was, that it felt like she was deliberately ignoring something important in my life, something that should have been a joyous moment between mother and daughter. I wasn't angry. I just wanted to express how I felt. Her reaction? She burst into tears. She sobbed, telling me she had bought champagne and had planned to toast us after dinner but forgot. She insisted that she was happy for me, that I was misinterpreting things, that she had never meant to make me feel that way. And then, just when I started to doubt myself, just when I started to wonder if maybe I was overreacting, Mark, my stepfather, chimed in. "You're being dramatic," he said. That was all it took for me to shut down. I didn't say another word the entire ride to the airport. I just stared out the window, watching the city I had once called home blur past me. The whole flight back to New York, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The ring. The silence. The way she always made herself the victim whenever I expressed even the smallest amount of hurt. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't normal. But if it wasn't normal, then what was it? And more importantly, how much longer was I willing to put up with it? By the time Daniel and I landed back in New York, I had made up my mind. I was going to keep things polite, but distant with my mother. There was no point in fighting for something I would never get. She would never react to my happiness the way a normal mother would, and I had to accept that. But, as always, just when I thought I had figured out how to manage her, she found a way to pull me back in. A few weeks after our visit, I got a text from her. "I have a surprise for you. I've been working on it for months. I think you're going to love it." I sighed, already wary. My mother's surprises never ended well for me. But a part of me, maybe the part that still hoped she would change, felt guilty for assuming the worst. A few days later, a package arrived. Inside was a scrapbook. Thick, heavy, and handcrafted with care. The cover was deep red, embossed with gold lettering that read, "A love story, the greatest bond that ever existed." At first, I thought maybe it was a sweet mother-daughter keepsake. Maybe this was her way of making up for Christmas. Maybe this was just a normal gift. I flipped it open. The first few pages were baby pictures of me. Some were sweet, my first steps, me sleeping on her chest as an infant, but the captions were unsettling. The moment I became whole. My soulmate born into the world. No love will ever compare. I swallowed hard but kept turning the pages. As I moved through the scrapbook, it became clear this wasn't just about my childhood. It was a timeline of our relationship. Not just the happy moments, but the moments when she felt I was slipping away. There was a page dedicated to the day I left for college, captioned, "The day my heart shattered." Another one had pictures of me with my ex-husband, accompanied by a passage about how she had known, from the start, that he was taking me away from her. The most disturbing part? There was an entire page dedicated to the ring. Not my engagement ring, the one she had planned to buy me. A picture of it was printed in the center of the page, surrounded by screenshots of her conversations with her friend about it. At the bottom, in her handwriting, she had written, "The ring I should have given her, the one she deserved." I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't a sweet mother-daughter scrapbook. This was an obsession. I shoved it back into the box and tried to shake off the nausea rolling through my stomach. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she didn't realize how weird this was. But my gut told me otherwise. Daniel walked in a few minutes later and saw my face. "What happened?" he asked. I wordlessly handed him the book, and as he flipped through it, his expression darkened. "This isn't normal," he finally said. "This is possessive. It's like she doesn't see you as a person, just as something that belongs to her." I knew he was right. I had known it for a long time. But hearing him say it made it real in a way I hadn't been ready to face. That night I lay awake, thinking about what to do. I could confront her, but what would that accomplish? She would cry, say I was being dramatic, and make me feel guilty for even questioning her intentions. Or I could ignore it and pretend it didn't bother me. But could I really keep pretending? The answer came a few days later. I woke up to find a voicemail from my mother. I almost didn't listen, but curiosity got the best of me. Her voice was soft, almost dreamy. "I was thinking about our bond today. About how no one could ever understand the love we share. People will come and go, but you'll always be mine. No matter what happens, we'll always be soulmates. I stared at my phone, my skin crawling. I had always known my mother's love was suffocating. I had always known it was too much. But this? This was something else entirely. This wasn't just unhealthy attachment. This was obsession. And suddenly, I knew. I couldn't keep pretending. I had to do something before it got even worse. After the scrapbook incident, I tried to create more emotional distance. I still answered my mother's calls, but I kept them brief. I still replied to her texts, but I never initiated conversations. I didn't confront her about the book or the voicemail. I knew exactly how that would go. She would cry, accuse me of being cold, and somehow I would end up apologizing. Instead, I decided to let it fade into the background, another unsettling thing to file away under reasons my mother makes me uncomfortable. Then came Valentine's Day. Now, I had always known my mother had a weird attachment to me, but her behavior on Valentine's Day had never been too extreme. A simple, "Happy Valentine's Day, my love," in past years, maybe a heart emoji. But this time, she went full throttle. At 8 a.m., before I had even gotten out of bed, I saw her first message. "Happy Valentine's Day, love of my life. I am, and I always will be in love with you, my gorgeous girl. I love you infinitely, forever and ever. Revolving hearts." I stared at my phone, half asleep, trying to process what I was reading. I almost replied with a simple, "You too," just to get it over with, but something about the phrasing made me stop. Love of my life? In love with you? That was not normal. That was not something a mother said to her daughter. I sighed, locked my phone, and ignored it. At 10 a.m., another message popped up. "Happy San Valentine's Day to you, my beautiful baby, the greatest blessing of my life, my purest and foreverlasting love. Revolving hearts." Attached was a video of me. It wasn't even a recent one, it was a selfie of me from years ago, with some dramatic love song playing in the background. Like a slideshow someone would make for their significant other. I felt a chill run down my spine. At this point, I showed Daniel. He read the texts and raised an eyebrow. "Okay, that's a lot." That was an understatement. I still didn't reply. By 9 p.m., she sent her final message. "You didn't wish me happy Valentine's Day." That was it. No hearts, no exclamation marks, just guilt, wrapped in 6 little words. I sighed and finally sent back a simple "Happy Valentine's Day." She didn't respond after that, but I knew she had gotten what she wanted, proof that she still had control over me. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I had spent my entire life brushing off her behavior as overbearing motherly love, but this didn't feel motherly. This felt possessive. Obsessive. It wasn't just the Valentine's messages. It was the scrapbook, the way she ignored my engagement, the fact that she had planned to buy me an engagement ring like I was her fiancé instead of her daughter. And the worst part? I had already told her that this kind of language made me uncomfortable. A few years ago, I had gently mentioned that phrases like, "You're my reason for living," put too much pressure on me. She had nodded, acted like she understood, and then continued saying the exact same things. She didn't care how it made me feel. Because to her, my feelings didn't matter, only hers did. I told my friends about the texts, expecting them to react the way Daniel did. I expected them to say, "Yeah, that's weird. She's way too attached to you." But instead, I got, "Oh, that's just how moms are. She just loves you a lot. You're lucky to have a mom who cares so much." Lucky? I didn't feel lucky. I felt trapped. And I was starting to realize that no one except Daniel would ever understand just how deep this went. The Valentine's Day texts were still fresh in my mind when my mother called a few days later. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some part of me, maybe guilt, maybe habit, made me answer. She was in an unusually chipper mood, talking about how excited she was for my wedding. This was strange because, until that point, she had barely acknowledged my engagement. But now, suddenly, she was eager to be involved. "I've been thinking," she said. "Since you don't have a father to walk you down the aisle, I should do it." I froze. I hadn't planned on having anyone walk me down the aisle. I had long since decided that I wasn't going to do the whole giving away the bride thing. It felt outdated, and besides, I didn't have that kind of relationship with my stepfather, Mark. I had no emotional attachment to him, but my mother? The idea of her walking me down the aisle horrified me. I could already picture it, her gripping my arm too tightly, eyes brimming with dramatic, self-indulgent tears. The way she would probably whisper something unsettling in my ear, like, "You'll always be mine." The way she would turn the moment into a symbol of our unbreakable bond rather than what it was supposed to be, a transition into my own life. I quickly shut it down, telling her that I wasn't planning to have anyone walk me down the aisle. She did not take it well. First, she acted wounded. "But I'm your mother," she said. "Who else would do it?" Then she tried guilt. "You're acting like I don't matter at all in your life." Then she went for the emotional manipulation. "I was there when you took your first steps. I was the one who raised you, loved you, sacrificed everything for you. And now I don't even get to be part of this moment." Her words made my stomach twist, but I held my ground. I told her that it wasn't about excluding her, it was about what felt right for me. That didn't satisfy her. A few days later, she texted me again. "If I can't walk you down the aisle, can I at least have the first dance with you?" I almost dropped my phone. The first dance? I hadn't even thought about doing one. Daniel and I weren't really the dancing type, but the fact that she had even asked was unsettling. She knew Daniel and I would likely have a first dance, and instead of seeing that as a moment between me and my future husband, she had decided that she should be the one to have it with me. As if this wedding wasn't about me and Daniel at all. As if, in her mind, she was the main character. Again, I said no. And again, she acted like I had ripped her heart out. She sent a long-winded text about how she understood. She absolutely did not. How she only wanted to be part of my big day. She wanted to be the center of it. And how she hoped I wasn't pushing her away. I absolutely was. Then, the final blow. "I don't think I should even come if I'm just going to be treated like a guest and not your mother." I stared at my phone, stunned. She had always done this, made it seem like my choices were personal attacks against her. The scrapbook, the ignored engagement, the Valentine's messages, all of it had been leading to this. She needed to reclaim her position. She needed me to prove that she was still the most important person in my life. And when I didn't give that to her, she threatened to make my wedding day all about her pain. I should have been angry. I should have been furious. But all I felt was exhaustion. I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say anymore. Because, at this point, it was clear that nothing I did would ever be enough for her. And, honestly, I didn't want it to be. Despite everything, my mother still came to the wedding. I wasn't sure if she would. After her guilt-tripping text, she went silent for weeks. No passive-aggressive messages, no over-the-top declarations of love. Just silence. And for the first time in my life, I felt relief. Daniel and I continued planning, and as the wedding day approached, I barely thought about her absence. If she wanted to skip it out of spite, that was her decision. I was done bending over backward to make her comfortable at my expense. But, of course, she wouldn't miss an opportunity to make a scene. She arrived alone, dressed in a long, white dress. It wasn't exactly a wedding gown. There was no lace or train, but it was unmistakably bridal. A shimmering ivory dress with delicate beading, almost as if she had gone out of her way to make sure she was just as much the center of attention as I was. I saw her as I walked down the aisle alone, exactly as I had planned. Our eyes met for a split second. Her expression was unreadable, but I could feel the disappointment radiating off of her. I could already imagine what was going through her mind. This should have been me walking her. She should have chosen me. I turned away, refusing to let her ruin the moment. The ceremony was beautiful, intimate, and exactly what I had wanted. I barely spared my mother a glance as Daniel and I exchanged vows, but I knew she was watching. When it was time for the reception, she sat stiffly at her table, barely speaking to anyone. A few guests noticed but assumed she was just emotional. Only I knew the truth. She wasn't sad. She was angry. Then came the moment that broke whatever fragile thread was still holding our relationship together. Daniel and I took the dance floor for our first dance, swaying gently as the music played. I was lost in the moment, in the warmth of his hands on my waist, in the quiet, steady love we had built together. And then, she stood up. I saw her out of the corner of my eye, walking toward us. I knew what she was doing before she even opened her mouth. She was going to cut in. I felt Daniel tense, but before he could say anything, I turned to face her. And for the first time in my life, I didn't soften my words. I didn't cushion the blow. I didn't care if she cried. Sit down, Teresa. Her eyes widened, as if she couldn't believe I had spoken to her that way. This is my wedding. This is my life. And you are not the main character in either of them. The entire room went silent. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, but I didn't let her. You have spent my entire life trying to make me feel like I owe you something. Like I have to shrink myself to fit inside whatever twisted version of love you forced on me. But I don't owe you anything. Not a dance. Not a thank you. Not even my presence in your life. She looked stunned. For the first time, she had no tears, no words, nothing to guilt me with. I turned my back on her, and I kept dancing. She left shortly after that. No dramatic exit, no grand display of emotions. She simply slipped away, like she had never been there at all. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. She tried to reach out in the weeks that followed. Messages about how much she loved me, about how she had only wanted to be part of my special day. But I didn't reply, because she was right about one thing. She had been my whole world once. But now? She was nothing but a memory I was finally ready to let go of.